Chapter 9. On the 2nd of July, I forgot Jane's birthday, and that was not the last time. I always had the greatest difficulty in remembering that her birthday was the 2nd of July and not the 4th of July, American Independence Day. We made friends with a young forestry officer and his wife who, like us, had a newborn child. When they joined us at our house for cards in the evening, they would place their newborn carefully in the drawer of one of our dressing tables. An old tea chest was our card table. We four sat on the 2 armchairs and 2 empty beer crates. Light came from kerosene pressure lamps and the open fire. Our floors were made of polished wood, decorated with a few skins of goat and buck. I was continuing to play hockey, but I was not able to keep as fit as I would have liked. Also, I found myself caught up in racial animosities, which were depressing. A year or 2 earlier, I'd gone with the NAC to play an Indian side in Kisumu, and had been astonished at the fanaticism of the Asian supporters. They hung around behind the back of my goal, creating as much disturbance as possible. They made every attempt to intimidate the NAC umpire and gave him a thoroughly unpleasant match. Now in Nakuru, there was the big match looming, Rift Valley versus the All India touring side. The Asians were desperate either to play themselves or to ensure that as many Asians as possible represented the Rift Valley. Early in the year, some Kenya trials had been held in Nakuru with selected Nairobi stars. When I had my trial, the top Kenya forward, Hilary Fernandez, a Goan, sliced the ball directly at my groin from no more than 5 yards. I had put on a large cricket box, but this was split in 2 by the impact, and I was rested. That's one way of reducing the European representation, I thought. At the time of the Rift Valley team selection, I was given the nod over an Asian goalkeeper, and this infuriated my Asian teammates. Come the day, 29th of June, we were overwhelmed 8-2. I was interested to see how much smaller the Indian Sikhs were compared to ours. Different food, I suppose, I thought. I felt I might have saved a couple of their shots, but each time they scored, the man who scored had broken right through our defence. Phil scored our 2 goals and made his mark that day to the extent that he was later to captain the East Africa side. I now stopped playing hockey and took up umpiring. This gave me more exercise, and I quickly found that I enjoyed it. The senior umpire came up from Nairobi to grade new umpires. He gave me an immediate award of B grade, bypassing the C grade. I was authorised to umpire all matches except national tournament finals or international matches. I think I'm going to have to stop feeding, Nigel. I'm getting a lot of pain. In fact, I think I'm getting a breast abscess, moaned Jane. Dr. Lowy was on holiday, so he went into T-Falls to see his Afrikaner assistant, who prescribed penicillin. This gave immediate relief, but then the pain kept returning and I was stunned to see Jane looking so obviously in deep pain. Dr. Lowy returned and we rushed in to see him. With some embarrassment, he confessed that his assistant had prescribed for Jane half the dose of penicillin she should have been taking. The enormity of my responsibility was now coming over me. Jane and our son were totally reliant on me for the basics of life. We bought a second bed and prepared to drive down to Nairobi Airport to collect Ma, who was coming from England for Nigel's baptism. Swollen with Rex's pups, Janet had been following Jane around, determined to be near her when she littered down. Eventually she produced 2 pups, and we could wait no longer. Some 6 to 7 hours later, when we returned with Ma, Janet had produced 8 pups. We decided to let her rear the 4 male pups, and then we would have her spayed. As usual, Nigel was being very difficult, screaming much of the time and continually bringing up his food. Ma took one look at her hollering grandson and announced, "I can see there's plenty of original sin in him." However, she was enchanted by the view from our house and soon had her painting gear out. Her painting of the view we had of the Aberdares from our house was to hang in our various homes for the rest of our lives. Having been a naval officer's wife, the club environment soon had memories flooding back for Ma. "You can't just sit here, you must learn to play bridge properly," she said to Jane, "and I will teach you." So, with some difficulty and even tears, Jane tried to learn to play bridge properly. In my teens, my choir school headmaster had taught me how to play bridge. He believed there were two important social graces for adolescent men, bridge and tennis. In my pre-war days, I had watched my parents playing both tennis and bridge at the Bonhomie Tennis Club in Wembley. Grandma had introduced me to cards even before that, via Patience, Rummy, and later the new rage she brought back from America, canasta. We took Ma to visit Torben. While I was visiting farmer customers, Torben took Ma around the extensive farm and left her painting a scene of the hills leading towards Mount Kenya. She was inspired. It was the best work she ever painted, getting through to the last selection committee for the Royal Academy exhibition in London. Later, she painted a copy for Torben that had pride of place above his sitting room fireplace. At this visit to Torben, the other occurrence of note was that Nigel frightened the life out of us by falling off a high bed onto the concrete floor. "I always said Jane would make a good poor man's wife," observed Ma genially. I didn't know what to reply. Jane was most dedicated and careful in the use of our joint bank account. However, I had no plan to remain poor. In fact, I had every ambition to become reasonably wealthy. Meanwhile, Nigel was not thriving. He threw up his food so frequently that Jane became certain there must be something seriously wrong with him internally. Dr. Lowy assured her that this was not the case, and he was proved right. While Nigel was still underweight and seemed not to be thriving, he was certainly active. He wore 2 nappies, soft inner ones and terry towel outer ones. When taken off, Jane rinsed these in the Murrum-coloured water, then put into a bucket of Milton overnight. Next morning, on her knees, she put them into a bath of the red water, washed and rinsed them several times, and then hung them on the washing line. Because of the doo-doos, grubs, fleas, jiggers, that could bury themselves in the child's skin, the nappies were then ironed by KR with the charcoal iron, which spattered the nappies with charcoal burns. And so it went on for Jane, day after day. There were no disposable nappies in those days. I used to enjoy imitating accents of speech and currently was going through my Italian phase. Jane was my darling and my bellissima. I was the Latin lover leaping out onto my bride to nibble her ear, etc. One day I leapt onto her in the clothes cupboard, arms around her waist, whispering sweet nothings. There was a giggle, followed by a protesting voice, which was definitely not of my bride. It was Ma. Good Lord, I bet there aren't many fellows who can claim to have groped their mother-in-law in the clothes cupboard, I thought. Nigel continued to be difficult and worrying for us. He vomited up his food like a projectile, following which he would produce a supersonic scream. We wandered into KV Unia, our local grocer at Old Jura Rock, to see if we could find some rusks to help him with his teething. The Dukawalla searched around his shelves in the gloom and came out with a tin of Ovaltine rusks in his hands. "Fine, we'll have them," said Jane. We got home and Jane opened the tin to find that the majority of the rusks were broken. Her complaints were loud and strong. "Well, what do you expect in the middle of Africa?" I retorted. "Goodness knows how long they've been in the store." "That doesn't matter. I'm not going to accept broken rusks from a company like Ovaltine," replied Jane. She wrote to them and complained. To my astonishment, virtually by return of post, we received not only a replacement tin of rusks, but sundry other goodies with Ovaltine's best wishes. I wonder what company provides that sort of service today. The pram Violet had given us was a real boon. Following Ma's departure back to the UK, we went down to the coast in the VW for a few days' holiday. The pram was made so that it would break conveniently into two. The body lay on the back seat as a cot with Nigel inside it, while the wheels and frame fitted conveniently into the rungs of the roof rack. So, with the wheels on top of the car, Nigel in his cot on the back seat, a large suitcase could be slotted behind the back seat. Then, under the bonnet next to the spare petrol tank, there was room for a small case. This left the car floor space, front and back, for goggles, flippers, sand shoes, refreshments. We were ready to go on safari. Soon after our return, we received news that Dad planned to visit us on his way back from Rhodesia. His trip to Rhodesia was a farewell present from the Rhodesia Railway's London office, where he had worked all his life. In the late 40s, he had been responsible for raising £2.5 million on the London market for the railways. As a child, I had seen diagrams and photos of locomotives on the walls of our house. All playing cards had been backed by a close-up photo of the Victoria Falls, at that time owned by the Rhodesia Railways. One of Dad's jobs had been to recruit staff in the UK to go out to Rhodesia. He had kept in contact with a number of these and had now arranged to visit them. Also, he had always booked passages for his recruits with the Castle Line. Now he used his influence to get the state cabin, the best cabin on his ship. I went in out of the sun, into the comparatively gloomy reception foyer of the Stanley Hotel, where I'd arranged to meet him. Looking round, at first I could see no sign of life on my side of the reception desk. Then, gradually, my eyes focused on a dishevelled figure sitting in a corner beside a couple of cases. Good Lord, he must have been having a time on the ship. He hasn't recovered, even after coming by train from Mombasa and spending a night at the hotel here. I shovelled Dad into the Beetle and drove him home at high speed. On the dirt road from Gilgil it was pretty slippery, and we had some interesting skids and slides. He opened his eyes apprehensively from time to time as he felt the car drifting sideways. On arrival at Old Jura Rock, after the greetings that courtesy demanded and gifts of presents to his hosts, he pleaded fatigue and retired to bed. There he stayed for the better part of 3 days. He then told us of his trip to Rhodesia, including the stretch from Mombasa to Beira, on which he had met Lucy, Alf McIntyre's sister, on her honeymoon en route for America. Finally, he announced that he was now recovered, and asked where the nearest hotel bar was. Recently, in the UK, a relation had left him and a cousin a sizable sum of money. Obscure members of the family had challenged the will, and the case had gone to the High Court. This had ruled in Dad's favour, and he made a point of saying that he and his cousin left the court with no stain on their characters. So Dad was feeling quite pleased with himself. The Citroën had become a non-runner, and I had given it as spare parts to a young Afrikaner. "You can't live here without a car," Dad said to Jane. He and I went down to Nakuru, where he bought a nearly new Hillman Minx estate car for Jane to use. Generally, British cars are not considered strong enough for Kenya conditions, but the Hillman was judged to be better than most. "And you can't have a bathroom without a mirror in it," Dad said to me. He bought the necessary equipment and screwed a mirror to the wall above the wash basin. Dad then disappeared in the Hillman to Eldoret to spend a few days with a friend he had met on board the ship. In the Beetle, I took Jane down to Nairobi for her driving test. Jane had driven a moped in England but had never passed a test for driving a car. I telephoned my old driving instructor friends who agreed to lend us a car for the test and contacted the examiners for us. "Okay, well done, you've passed the theory," said the examiner. "Now drive me out of the car park, along the road, round the corner to the left, and then stop by the curb." Jane drove as instructed. "Right, well done, that's good enough. If you call in the office this afternoon, I'll have completed the documentation so you can pick up your license. Now, I'll take you back to the car park where Ian's waiting for you." A week later, we were driving in convoy out to Torben's farm. Torben was doing well. Not only was he on the way to buying the farm he had been managing, but also he had started leasing the neighbouring ranch. The main road to Nanyuki had recently been graded, and I was able to push our speed up towards 65 miles an hour. From out of the thorn trees ambled a giraffe. There was no chance of stopping in time. In my mind, I wondered if the VW Beetle might actually be able to pass under the giraffe's belly. I remembered seeing a horrible wreck of a car that had failed to achieve this. The giraffe had subsided on the car and squashed it quite flat. In the event, we were lucky. We passed about a yard in front of the animal, and I have never forgotten the extraordinary experience of looking up at his kneecap as we skidded by. "Howdy," I called. "Caribou," came Torben's answer. "Oh, it's you, old boy, and your beautiful wife and child." He clicked his heels as he bent over Jane's hand. "And your father. It's fantastic weather we've been having here, Mr. Osborn. Do come in, all of you. It's a pleasure to have you here." From Torben's farm, while I looked after Nigel, Dad took Jane for a night at Treetops outside Nyeri. A hotel built in trees, Treetops was famed the world over. An armed warden took guests through the forest to the hotel in the afternoon. As the sun set, lights were turned on to illuminate the water holes, so the game could be watched and photographed at night. "By the way, Ian, old boy, what's this contraption I see in your luggage?" "Oh, it's a water filter." Jane's nervous of Nigel drinking water that has been inadequately boiled. "Well, I'm sure my boy would boil the water just fine, but still, if that's what Jane wants." Torben was offended. For years he would grumble good-humouredly about the day Jane arrived at his house with a water purifier. Prior to Dad's visit, I'd been searching for ways to improve our financial situation. Burning olive trees and selling the resultant charcoal had been useful. Now I turned my thoughts to the cedar trees, and Kasuku agreed to buy some of them from me. In went his skilled workers to cut out the better cedars. I began to feel I might be able soon to reduce our bank overdraft. Meanwhile, back in London, the politicians had held a meeting at Lancaster House to decide the future of Kenya. At this meeting, a British government representative commented that the settlers had never bothered to get to know the African, or really the country. Blundell's answer was to address the meeting in Kiswahili for the next half hour, to the intense annoyance of the British government representatives who couldn't understand a word of it, and the great amusement of his colleagues. They could all have done the same. Anyway, that meeting decided Kenya would become a democracy, based on one man, one vote. When the news reached Kenya, our domestic economy, which had been based traditionally on credit, became cash overnight. All creditors, the dukas, clubs, banks, started calling in their debts. At Tea Falls, there was a procession of farmers going in to see another new bank manager who was demanding immediate reduction and elimination of overdrafts. I was among them. Our overdraft was not large compared to many, but the bank manager was sufficiently hostile to alarm me. Also, overnight, all building work in Kenya stopped. Consequently, our cedar trees were now valueless and the timber workers were withdrawn. We took Dad on safari to see some of Western Kenya. through Nakuru and Londiani up to the tea-growing area around Kericho. On such trips, judging petrol consumption and where one would be able to refill was not easy. I made a misjudgment, and it looked as if we had run out of petrol before we could reach the next duka with a petrol pump. "Just like he always was, he hasn't changed. He was always a chancer," came from Dad, who saw himself about to be stranded in the middle of Kenya with no petrol. I reduced speed to a crawl and switched off the engine and coasted at every downhill stretch. We just managed to reach a pump with about a teaspoonful of petrol left in our tank. On the way back, we went to a party at the NAC, staying the night at the Stag's Head Hotel. Dad was thoroughly enjoying himself at the party, showing that indeed he had played rugby for the Wasps as a young man by kicking a rugby ball well and truly into the middle distance, to the applause of the onlookers. Eventually it approached midnight, and Jane and I suggested that it was time to go back to the hotel. Nigel was asleep in the back of the car. "What? Oh, you go back to the hotel. Take the car. I'll make my own way back," was the reply. Goodness knows when he got back to bed. Certainly Jane and I never heard him. When I next saw a friend of mine, Johnny P. Patterson, he remarked with some respect, "Your dad's certainly one for a party, Ozzy." Dad had been good at all sports. Not only had he played fullback for the Wasps, at football he had once been asked to play centre forward for Millwall, whose 3 centre forwards were injured. He scored the one goal of the match. I remember his cricket performances being written up in the local newspaper. He was singles tennis champion of our local club at Wembley, and he was a skillful bridge player. Soon it was time for him to return to the UK. I drove him down to Nairobi to catch the train for Mombasa. Typically, there was always plenty of room on it, especially since the economy had suffered as a result of the Lancaster House Agreement. To my consternation, there were many people milling about in front of the station. "Shurigani?" I asked. The reply was that part of the road had been washed away, so everyone was trying to get onto the train. "Oh Lord, there's no way Daddy's going to get onto the train today, or even tomorrow," I thought. We wandered through the crowd into the station forecourt. Suddenly, to my consternation, Dad had walked away from us, raising his voice to a startled, officious-looking Sikh who was standing against a wall surveying the crowd. In no time, they had disappeared round the side of the counter into an office at the back. 10 minutes later, Dad emerged. "That's all right, I'm on the train," he remarked. "How on earth did you manage that?" "Oh, I just showed him my farewell gift watch, with its 36 years Rhodesia Railway inscribed on the back. We railway people stand together, you know." Our bank manager continued to call me in to discuss my progress in reducing my overdraft. Yet somehow the edge had gone from his demands. It was some years later that I discovered Dad had gone into the bank and said to the manager, "I want you to continue to press him for the money he owes you. He needs to understand that loans have to be paid back with interest. However, please draw up a relevant document for me to sign, with me as guarantor for his overdraft at a figure no higher than its present balance. But he is not to be informed of this." My work was going well. In effect, I now had the job of field sales supervisor as well as area rep. So it was that in September 1959, Johnny P., who had recently joined Cooper's, was sent to me for some field training. Johnny slept in our spare bedroom, in the bed that had been necessary for Ma's visit. He was a well-built Kenya lad who had been a manager on a large estate. His father was a doctor. He had a broad, infectious grin, lived life to the full, and had brought his useful hockey-playing ability to the NAC side. I took Johnny into my own farm calls with me, so he could get the feel for the job. Then I prepared him to make a call on his own. We parked outside the farmer's garden hedge. The call had been rehearsed carefully. "Now this is what you should say, this is what he will reply, this is then what you will say," etc., etc. Then you will ask for the order. Eventually Johnny emerged through the hedge, grinning from ear to ear. Well, Ozzy, I told him what you told me to. He said exactly what he said he would. I answered him as we had rehearsed, and I got the order. I became more than ever convinced that I could enthuse and lead people. It was a question of showing competitiveness, commitment, and enthusiasm. Meanwhile, the political world did not stand still. The Mau Mau emergency, with its attendant government powers, was declared over. At Barry's hotel, Michael Blundell spoke to a gathering of settlers. He outlined his thoughts on the prospective aspects of Kenya's future. He looked forward to how the country might earn its way in the world and put it to us that tourism could become an important industry. Following up on this idea, he told us that he had written to the Reader's Digest, asking them to run an article on Kenya's wildlife and Indian Ocean coastline. The Reader's Digest had asked him how many hotel beds Kenya could offer. On receiving his reply, they had commented that when the availability was multiplied 50 times, the article could be run. They anticipated the demand that would be generated by the article would overwhelm Kenya's current hotel space. Humphrey Slade, besides being a lawyer and right-of-centre politician of great integrity, was also a director of Cooper, MacDougall and Robinson, EA Limited. He brought a new African politician to address a meeting of settlers at Gilgil. His name was Daniel Arap Moi, later to be the President of Kenya. Soon afterwards, at the RASK show in Nairobi, I met Humphrey Slade on the Cooper stand. "Sir, I didn't think a lot of what Daniel Arap Moi had to say the other day. He wasn't very impressive, was he?" "Whatever you may think, Ian, it does not alter the fact that the Africans deserve to be represented," was his firm, unambiguous reply. At HQ, Mr. Hammond was having trouble in finding a suitable sales manager. He drove up to Old Jura Rock and visited us on our farm. "Ian, I would like you to take on the job of sales manager." This was some compliment, and yet it was so contrary to our plans. I asked for time to consider the offer. He gave us 2 weeks. I brooded. For 12 years my whole life has been devoted to trying to become a farmer, I thought. First in England, now here. Jane married me to be a farmer's wife. We have the debt to Corbett, the pyrethrum we have just started to harvest. I love my job, the excitement of the sales arena, the competitive nature of the job. And yet my heart is in farming, and I have developed so many friends up here. After all, this is what we fought for in the emergency, isn't it? This is what my friends died for, to develop a lovely country with beautiful farms and friendly rural communities. It's true that following the Lancaster House giveaway, the European is going to have less influence, but isn't Kenya my destiny? I don't know. How can I leave all this and go down to Nairobi? And anyway, Jane wants to be a farmer's wife. "You are good for me," I said to Jane. To Mr. Hammond I wrote my regrets. So 1960 went by. Davo married an Afrikaner widow who farmed outside Old Kaloo. With an interest-free government loan, I bought 130 sheep from a young Austrian farmer in the Old Kaloo Valley. I now had to try to control the movement of the sheep around the farm. To some extent, this would be achieved by the use of a herd boy, but I wanted to do better than that. Fencing is very much a specialist job, and I couldn't afford to hire a fundi to do it. So, having taken some advice on the matter from a Tea Falls farmer, I bought wire, staples, posts and strainers and set about it. The results were not a great success. They used to say you could tell the quality of a farmer by looking at his fencing. I would have been embarrassed if anyone had put the same rule over me. Anyway, I consoled myself, it's better than nothing. I had boasted to Jane about how much better a farmer I would be than the average Kenya settler. My boast was now being put to the test. From my UK old employers, I imported an excellent pedigree Romney Marsh ram. Moving into sheep brought us more problems than I had expected. The grassland had never previously had livestock on it. It was alive with ticks, just waiting for warm-blooded hosts. The sheep and their lambs suffered so much that Jane was up many nights nursing them. She couldn't stand the thought of having sick animals in our care. Fortunately, the ram himself seemed to take to Kenya immediately and was never sick. Roger Brown had been posted to the Nanyuki area, and the new government vet for the area was a Dane, John Anderson. He was very knowledgeable on horses, but knew little about sheep. When I called him in to register our ram, he registered him as a Corrierdale. This had to be corrected. In March 1960, another new sales rep, James Kepi, was sent to me for sales training. To be a good salesman, I think we have to see the best side of every customer. However difficult or even rude they may be, we have to keep our good humour, I said. You mean I never met a guy I didn't like, that sort of thing? Yes, something like that. Okay, I've got the message. A quiet Scot, James had been an agricultural officer in Tanganyika, and he was very helpful in demonstrating to us how to keep our sheep's feet properly trimmed. We were to stay friends for life. As was always the custom, on our farm the labour had their own plots of land on which they grew their vegetables, and it was the farmer's responsibility to protect them. I had been asked more than once to shoot marauding monkeys that came down from the forest trees. One afternoon we heard the dreadful sound of the crackling of bushfire. Apparently it had started on Corbet's labour plots and was moving dangerously over the boundary through our labour plots towards our house, which was surrounded by trees and therefore particularly vulnerable. We worked desperately to create a fire break. The fire continued to creep closer, spitting sparks everywhere. And then, for some unknown reason, it died down as quickly as it had started. That's Africa for you, I thought. Every day brings another drama. My ambitions regarding pyrethrum growing received some knocks. Day after day, Jane and I would watch the rain clouds build up. Day after day, we would see the rain falling on Old Kalu, but none fell on Old Jura Rock. Well, you know, Osborn, it always used to be dry here, remarked Colonel Corbett. It's only in recent years that we've had enough rain for good pyrethrum growing. Perhaps the weather is reverting back to the dry days. It's all right for you, I thought. It may be no more than an inconvenience for you. It could break us. Thinking about water had become an obsession. Water for the house and water for the farm. Not only did we need water for domestic and garden use, but the sheep needed it, and the pyrethrum seed beds needed it, and indeed we wanted the Almighty to deliver it to the mature pyrethrum plants out in the fields. How dangerous a lack of water could be was soon brought home to us. Colonel Corbett's borehole machinery which pumped our water to us broke down, and for a time he delivered it in 40-gallon drums. I heard rumour of a water diviner who was well reported on, and who was going around the farms. I contacted him and he came to us. He turned out to be a highly engaging Pole who had fought with the RAF in the war. He potted around and then his twigs turned down at a convenient spot near our house. "Come on here, I'll show you," he said. So Jane took his twigs, and with his guidance the twigs twisted down over exactly the same spot. I tried it, but they didn't turn down for me. "Oh well, you're an unbeliever," he said. "They won't work for you if you don't believe in them." One couldn't help being impressed at the almost violent way that the twigs had turned down. Fairly soon after that we sold to Ken Jocelyn, so I had no chance to prove whether or not water was indeed under there for us to reach and pump up for use. Janet's puppies had been given away, hopefully to good homes, and now she and Jane were inseparable. Even so, Jane noticed that Janet was trailing ever closer behind her heels. What was the matter? We got Anderson to visit us. He failed to recognize a tick-borne disease, and to our great grief, Janet died a few days later. Jane was inconsolable. We met Roger Brown, the government veterinarian, and told him of our sorrow. He was scornful of the failure to diagnose and treat Janet in time. Some time later, Anderson left Tea Falls to work as veterinarian at Egerton Agricultural College in the Rift Valley, and later he returned to Denmark. We bought Jane another Alsatian bitch. We named her Emma. While she could never replace Janet in Jane's affections, with Jane's training she grew to be sensible, and with Rex's help, she produced 2 litters. It was not unusual for Emma and Sandra the Scottie to have differences of opinion. One day, according to KR, while Jane and I were away, he saved Sandra's life. He spotted Emma in time, carrying Sandra off in her mouth into the forest to demolish her. Early in the emergency, the Meiklejohns, both doctors, had been attacked at night by the Mau Mau. The Mau Mau had seemed to attack soft targets, often people who were indeed actively trying to help the Africans. He had been killed by panga cuts. Dorothy, his wife, had been so badly chopped around the head and hands that despite many skin grafts, she was still quite badly disfigured. Her daughter, Sally, was now to be married in Tea Falls to an American she had met in the United States. Jane and I were invited to the wedding. The whole European community turned out. The sun shone, and it really was a gesture of solidarity the settlers were able to show to one of their own. This is why I'm still here, I thought. These are our friends. Despite the rain failures, I started to prepare more ground for pyrethrum and bought an old Ford tractor. Also, I persuaded John Clift, the teenage son of a Nanuki farmer who I'd met somewhere or other, to join us. This large lad was good with machinery and quietly earned the respect of the farm labour. We offered him the spare bedroom and he settled in quickly. The pyrethrum planting progressed apace and I was delighted. However, it soon became obvious to both of us that I did not have the resources to meet his ambitions, and after 3 months he left. My selling career had progressed well. I had control of the territory because I had control of the distribution network. Our main exclusive wholesaler, the KFA, had most of the farmers as members. If any preferred to deal with Kasuku's chain, well, Kasuku also stocked nothing competitive to Cooper products. South African companies that started trying to break into the market with cattle dips similar to Cooper's, using some large farmers as stockists, had found it almost impossible in my area. There was the occasional small setback. A competent but fairly indolent Cooper rep was fired. He joined a new company in the market, Lee Brothers and Blakeman, which specialized in mineral feed supplements. For me, mineral feed supplements were just one of the 8 product groups. Consequently, my erstwhile colleague was able to concentrate on his narrow front, to the extent that, as far as mineral feed supplements were concerned, I took a beating. He would say, "Yes, well, the Cooper supplements are okay, but we are the experts in the supplement market." His product knowledge and ability to sell mineral feed supplements soon exceeded mine. It was a lesson I took to heart for the rest of my working life. It didn't need Field Marshal Montgomery to tell me of the benefits of concentrating on a narrow front. I loved the freedom of planning each day, then setting off in a cloud of dust, shaving all the while with my newly acquired clockwork razor, to visit a variety of farmers. I had some interesting characters as customers. On the foothills of Mount Kenya there was Beryl Markham, revered as an aviator. In 1936 she had made world headlines by becoming the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic from east to west. She had taken off from England and crash-landed in Nova Scotia 21.5 hours later. In 1942, she had written some memoirs, West with the Night, and in Kenya she had become a highly successful horse trainer. On a small leased farm outside Old Kalou, there was Dr. Anne Spurry, who, in 1996, was to write her autobiographical book, Mama Daktari. She had become quite a heroine with the Marquis in Paris during the war and was now a country doctor. In 1963, aged 45, she was to start flying as one of the flying doctors attached to the African Medical and Research Foundation. Also, there was the excellent watercolour painter, Hobo Swift, brother-in-law of John Armitage, Bwana Kisu. There were so many interesting people to meet. They all tended to be somewhat larger than life. The histories of some were almost unbelievable, but then something would happen to make one realize that most of it was probably true. Alf McIntyre's father, Len, was said to have been a professional sprinter in the north of England. Well, nowadays one rarely saw him sober. Then one day I was watching a T-Falls cricket match and one batsman asked for a runner. Out to the wicket trotted Len, who had probably not run a couple of yards in the last 30 years. But to see him over the next 20 minutes was a revelation. He was halfway back on a second run before the other batsman had completed his first. This was Kenya, and I loved it. Kenya was a place for people who could love with real passion, people who believed there was more to life than life itself. Their love of Kenya transcended all else. There were the politicians Michael Blundell and Humphrey Slade, who was to become Speaker of the House at the invitation of independent Kenya. Bruce Mackenzie, the Nakuru farm manager from South Africa, who had referred my comeback match for T-Falls, was to become Minister of Agriculture and be blown up in a mysterious air explosion. There were the professionals, such as Robbie Matthews, the Nanyuki pharmacist. I would like to recommend you as a mason, Ian. You seem to be the right sort of person for us. I was aware that before the arrival of Mr. Hammond, Coopers had revolved around masons. The old MD, Bill Floyd, the accountant, and at least one rep had been masons. Dad had said to me once, if you want to get to the top in the city, you have to be a mason. I knew that masonry involved taking oaths. My recent experience of the bestial Mau Mau oaths naturally repelled me from oath-taking, and my whole schooling had been towards achievements through one's own ability, rather than club membership or privilege. I couldn't avoid the privilege of the old school tie, something they can't take away from you, my mother had said darkly. Who they were I never discovered, nor could I help the colour of my skin. But the whole idea of oathing in a mutual self-help club did not appeal to me. At Timau, 20 miles northeast of Nanyuki, there was a collection of sheep and cattle ranchers who owned and managed some excellent farms. Many of the farmers were not only Cooper customers, they were also personal friends of ours. There was the grand old Scotch sheep farmer Will Powles and his family, who took our first African representative, Seth Nzoka, into their farms for him to get experience of large-scale farming methods. On one stretch of land towards Naibor from Nanyuki, that seemed to be owned by nobody in particular, I stopped at a group of African huts to ask where I was. Out of one of the huts emerged a European, apparently blind, the rim of his hat coming down to his mouth. He was led by the arms by Africans, who obviously held him in high affection. He answered my question quite helpfully, with a strong South African accent. Who he was, I never discovered. There was Madge Berryman, on the wall of whose bungalow I had been startled to see prints of King's Canterbury buildings. As old boys together, he and I had long, nostalgic chats. My erstwhile officer from Rhodesia, Tony Barkus, had now left the army and lived and worked on his in-laws' cattle ranch. An example of the extraordinary settler hospitality and friendship was shown to us during Dad's stay. We went for the evening to the house of a near neighbours, a South African couple. It was some weeks later that we discovered our host and his wife had been expecting us the following evening. A full meal was produced, and in no way did they reveal their surprise, nor give us any embarrassment. What people! There were the European shopkeepers. All Europeans had a stake in the country, had devoted their lives and the lives of their families to attempt to build a country on the lines of the old country. Some of them held unimaginably high standards. Jane and I were in Nakuru one day, and I went into the European barber's shop and sat to await my turn. Eventually, having finished her shopping, Jane joined me. The barber asked her politely but firmly to leave. His was a barber's shop for men. Ladies were not allowed. As was so often the case in Kenya, one would be ruminating in an almost dreamlike way about the affection one had for the country and one's surroundings, when the dream would be shattered by some example of death, disease, or destruction. On this occasion, I heard the bad news on the phone from the KFA manager at Nanyuki and later direct from Torban. My reactions are best expressed by my thoughts at the time as I wrote them down. My, it's all happening in Nanyuki. Torban has been flown down to the Nairobi hospital because a cow gored him by accident in the groin. I was so angry I nearly shot her with my Luger, he said, and Roger Brown had been killed in a flash flood in the Nanyuki-Naromoro road after dark. Apparently he had managed to stop his car in time, had climbed down into the gully to see if there was somewhere he could cross, and had been swept away. In the same floods, Torban had 40 heifers washed away, but they managed to scramble to safety. Roger's death was a sad blow to us. He had been such a good veterinarian, and we had got to know his Austrian wife, Rosemary, and their 4 children at the family home they rented in Nakuru. Rosemary was a keen bridge player, and more than once we had driven down there for a game. I remembered Rosemary's carefully controlled temperament, and the day she exploded with annoyance at the Tea Falls Club. Rosemary had a coloured visitor with whom she had been at university in the USA. She took her to the club expecting, naively perhaps, that her visitor's obvious educational and social qualities, and the fact that she was put forward as the Browns' guest, would obtain temporary membership for her. Not a bit of it. She could walk around the grounds with Rosemary, but she was not allowed into the clubhouse. Club rules would not allow it. Which was more the more remarkable because the clubhouse was little more than a large corrugated iron-roofed bungalow. In all probability, the American guest had rarely been inside a scruffier, less pretentious building. I maintained an interest in sport generally by becoming the Rift Valley sports correspondent of the Sunday Post. When I worked at the agricultural show in Nairobi that year, we were put up in the Queen's Hotel, cheap. Late in the evening, Nigel started one of his fits of screaming. Having noticed that lying on the back seat of the car seemed to settle him, I suggested to Jane that I drive him round Nairobi. Carrying him down the corridor, I was passed by an European who looked startled. "You must be Scandinavian." "Well, no." "Well, your boy there looks absolutely Scandinavian," replied the unknown. I drove Nigel around Nairobi for half an hour or more, and then carried him, comatose, back to our room. Coopers had woken up to the fact that Harry Carroll was having a big impact on the farming community. He was technically so knowledgeable and at the same time such a convincing and persuasive speaker that the farmers flocked to his meetings. Mr. Hammond decided to hold a Cooper Sheep Day at Quebec, where Dr. Carroll would be the main speaker. Over the months since his arrival, his great success had created some resentment and jealousy in the government research labs. This Australian, with his big talk and no local knowledge, Doesn't he realise that where sheepfoot rot is concerned, for example, in Kenya we have Fusiformis X, not the Fumiformis Y, that he has undoubtedly been using in the other countries where he has performed? These criticisms reached the ears of the farmers and of Harry Carroll, whose riposte was well planned. Towards the end of his talk at the open-air Cooper Sheep Day at Quebec, he said, "I understand that some people are saying that my recommendations for foot rot control may be inaccurate, because it is not in fact the Fusiformis Y that I am most familiar with that you have here, but rather it is your local Fusiformis X." He paused and looked around at a pen of a sheep nearby. "Fetch me that ewe hobbling there, will you?" he asked. The sheep was brought. He grabbed it, sat it down, lifted one of its legs, put his nose into the animal's foot, sniffed, looked up and called out to the crowd, "I don't care what you call it, that's foot rot." The farmers fell about with laughter. Ah, the pleasure of seeing one put over on their colonial masters.